let me move on and talk a little bit more about capacitors. To some degree, capacitors and supercapacitors is what they've been termed because of a advertising quirk. They're kind of the, they're the youngest child in the family, so to speak. So they get the hand-me-downs, if you will. And this, again, is a plot of the power density as a function of the energy density. And we can see where various types of energy sources are here. We have fuel cells over here. These are not secondary. You can't charge them. But you can see that fuel cells give you very high energy density. They don't necessarily give you good power density. Batteries do not quite give you all that energy density, but they do give you more power. And then you can see supercapacitors, sort of in this great middle between batteries and the type of capacitors that we have, barium titanate type capacitors, where you store charge, but for very short periods of time. And supercapacitors have this great middle ground where you can have higher power, but you don't quite have the high energy density of batteries. And so it's very clear that what you would like to do, and I'll go over this again, is you'd like to go towards this white area, where you are able to have high energy density and high power density. But I should first mention that capacitive energy storage via supercapacitors has improved dramatically over the past decade. We now see that we're able to get something on the order of 200 farads per gram, and I'll convert that into other energy units later. The key part is that these are very fast, they're high power, and they give you long cycle life, 1 million cycles. These are very attractive. I'll talk about the energy storage mechanism, but very briefly, this is a physical process, as you have only at the interface that you have ions that are stored. The limitation with these types of devices, which are called electric double-layer capacitors, has to do with the fact that their energy density is low. So they have the power that you want, but they don't have the energy density. Nonetheless, because of the power over the past decade, have improved their market share to about $1 billion a year, and they're projected to grow at about 15% a year because they are the only game in town when it comes to high power. And so they're used in a variety of different consumer items, also industrial items, and of course, and other automobiles as well. They're finding their way into that as well. So there's a healthy market. It's a broad-based market, and so that's going to continue to grow. But it also says that we can now think about the fact that maybe the best strategy is to blur the distinction between what's a battery and what's a capacitor. At the end, what we want to do is to store charge. And we would like to store charge up in this range, up in the white area. So again, here's the plot, which is called a Rigoni plot, by the way, of, again, our power as a function of energy density. The supercapacitors are in blue, and so they give you the high power. And the battery materials and the batteries are in green. And so there is, of course, as I mentioned, there's a lot of interest in going up area of high energy density and high power density. We talk often about the fact that we want materials that have the energy density of a lithium-ion battery, but the power density of a capacitor. We don't have that today. In fact, we're not even close. So the question is, how do you get there? Do you take lithium-ion batteries and you try to improve the materials on them, maybe by making them nanoscale, changing their chemistry and so forth? Or do you try to go in this direction, where you take a supercapacitor and then try to go to the right by functionalizing it or doing something to that? The jury's out, and the reason is because we really don't know what's going to be the best way. But as I indicated, I think what's important here is that you begin to blur the distinction. Go here, this would really be a tremendous improvement. And let me just give you a couple of areas where there's a real need for high energy and high power density. We see statements like this, where we're going to be able to charge cars in 5 minutes. Well, that's great. Maybe you can get these charging stations that can produce the necessary power, but definitely you do not have the energy storage device in this white automobile that is going to be able to accept that charge in 5 minutes. And then, of course, let's not forget consumer electronics. In fact, this is probably in many ways the best driver. Again, because of the intense competition that you have here, the ability to charge our devices in 5 minutes or 3 minutes is a tremendous advantage for market share. So there's a lot of interest in that. And if we look just a little bit further, and you read the newspapers, you hear about the Internet of Things. We're going to have our refrigerators talking to us. We already have items that are monitoring our heart rate and so forth, oxygen levels and the like. And all this is going to go into the cloud. And it all requires mobile power to do that. So it's all going to require some sort of battery or some sort of capacitor to do this. So I think that the driver is there. The question is, how do we get there, and what are the advantages, and what's the science, and where are we now? So let me briefly go back to fundamentals. We were talking about charge storage. In capacitors, we have an electrified interface. This would be a carbon electrode, for example. This would be the electrolyte. We call that a double layer. And the amount of energy that you store there is directly proportional to the surface area of what you can do in terms of that. In the case of a lithium-ion battery, in that case, we're moving lithium ions between an anode and a cathode, and we're having a process that we call intercalation. And you can see even from this diagram, what happens is that, of course, as you intercalate ions into the structure has to expand and contract accordingly. So it's not hard to imagine why these materials are going to fatigue over time, why their lifetimes are not infinite. In contrast with double layer capacitors, these are the devices that last for 1 million cycles. So in the area of supercapacitors, though, we talk about two different types of mechanisms. One I've gone over, and that's the double layer capacitor, and that's what you see over here. And that has a limited amount of capacitance. I mentioned 200 farads per gram. That's like a best result. But usually 100 farads per gram is pretty reasonable. The new kid on the block, so to speak, is pseudocapacitance. It was really more or less discovered, or let me just say revitalized in the 1970s. And the idea here is that at the surface you have redox reactions. Redox reactions are how you store energy in a lithium-ion battery. And so we talk about redox pseudocapacitance, and the best example of this is ruthenium oxide, where you protonate it, the materials actually are already hydrated, you protonate it and you induce a valence change in the ruthenium. Well, ruthenium's great, it's just a little bit expensive. And the result that you get out of this is what looks like a capacitor, and that's why it's called a pseudocapacitance. But the idea here is that you are able to have the energy density of what you would have with a lithium-ion battery, and you have vastly improved power density because of the fact that it's acting like a capacitor. And so this is a field that really has now had a lot of appeal. There's been a lot of work in it in the last 5 years or so. And the whole idea is that if you can improve the energy density beyond what you get with a double layer capacity and still maintain those wonderful properties that you had before about short charging times and long cycle life, then you really can make an impact in the field. So what do we have in terms of the current state of the art? So here's what we see for the different types of supercapacitors. I've included carbon, which is a double layer capacitor, just for reference point. Conducting polymers, they also have been looked at in some degree. Ruthenium oxide, because of various applications, more or less related to military applications. They've received the bulk of the amount of study. You can see that they are up at over 1,000 farads per gram. And in fact, if you look at something like manganese oxide, that should be well over 1,200 farads per gram. But unfortunately, the reality is that they're not. And that these materials, the oxides, which should be giving us very high values of capacitance, they are not for various reasons. And that's what I'm going to delve into in the next few minutes. And before I do that, let me give you just a 1-minute tutorial, I promise no longer than that, on electrochemistry. I've already badmouthed electrochemists, so let me try to make amends. So first, I'm going to talk about cyclic voltammetry. And this is just to give you a reference point of what we're going to be talking about. This is going to be a triangular wave, and when we put a triangular wave into a material, you'll often get a current response. And that's what you see over here. With this current response, you reverse the triangular wave, and you now get another curve. So we would call this a redox reaction. In one case, you're oxidizing. In the other case, you're reducing. And you could change the sweep rate, which means you can change the kinetics. You could go cycle it and so forth. And of course, the area underneath this curve is what tells you how much energy you're storing. So it's a very nice bit of, it's very straightforward. The experiments that we do in the laboratory are in 3 electrode cells, and everything works out very nicely. And now the entire audience now knows about cyclic voltammetry. Okay, so what do we do about this? We're going to use cyclic voltammetry to identify materials that tell us about high energy and power density. And the way that we do this is by going back to fundamentals. And in fact, this peak current that we saw when we were oxidizing or reducing the material, it turns out that peak current is very strongly dependent upon how fast the sweep rate is, and it has to do with the fact this is a diffusion-controlled reaction. So anytime that we see that the peak currents are varying with the sweep rate to the 1/2 power, we know we have a diffusion-controlled reaction, and that's what we have in battery materials. Oops. But if we are just linear in the sweep rate, then that's what capacitive behavior is. The reason I bring this out is because by a very straightforward mechanism, we can now take a look at the current that we generate as a function of sweep rate in one of these cyclovoltammetry experiments, and we could tell the difference between something that's diffusion controlled and low power and something that's going to be more like a capacitor and high power. So we now have a nice metric to do this. We also can see that we are going to have a little bit of a problem, and it's this way. If we want high energy density, we need to have these redox reactions because that's what gives you high energy density. If you want high power, you need to have a capacitor. And these are current voltage characteristics, I should add. And here's the problem. With energy in the battery materials, when you have redox reactions, and here's our lithium iron phosphate that I mentioned before, the exponent is 0.5. It's diffusion controlled. And this is one of the best, most active materials, one of the highest rate materials. When you have a when you have a capacitor, B value is equal to 1. So we see what the problem is. We see that what we need is an anomaly. We need a material that's going to give us redox reactions, but we're going to need it to operate under very fast conditions. And so you need an anomaly. That's nice. And fortunately, we have one, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let me talk about the way out of this. The way out of this is actually a little bit not as difficult as it might seem. So here's what we've seen before. This is our cyclic voltammetry. In the case of a capacitor, we get a box. In the case of a battery material, we have redox reactions. What I didn't mention are what's called galvanostatic or constant current experiments. In constant current experiments, when you have a capacitor, then what happens is that the voltage drops continuously as a function of charge, and in fact, that's what defines a capacitor. In the case of a battery material, you have a plateau, which has to do with the fact that you may have various types of reactions occurring, multiple phases are present. But if you make it as a nanomaterial, you change it. And now the battery material begins to look like a capacitor. And so I refer to this as being something that's an intrinsic capacitor, and that's where you have this type of behavior versus an extrinsic pseudocapacitor. And so now let me just mention, going back to intrinsic pseudocapacitance, we have an anomaly. And the anomalous material is niobium oxide. I'm not going to go through all the details of here. Here's our cyclic voltammetry. The audience is now well familiar with this. It almost looks like a box. You have to use your imagination. But I think when you're in the science business, you always are using your imagination. But the key part is how fast is a charge, and you get to 75% of theoretical in about a minute, which is really very impressive. So that all looks very nice. And from this, we've been able to now come up with what I call signatures of why we can now identify pseudocapacitor materials. And these are the materials that are going to give us high energy density and high power density. It's going to be in that white area that I talked about before. This has to do with the fact that the log of the current as a function of sweep rate should be linear. That's the B equal to 1. Also, to define what a capacitor is, it means that the potential as a function of capacity should be linear. So that's another feature. When you have peaks, then you should also have the differential between where the reduction and the oxidation peak. That voltage difference should be very small. That makes it more reasonable from a fundamental standpoint. You also should get something that looks like a box when you do a cyclic voltammogram. And then the most important feature from the standpoint of material science is no phase change. When you insert lithium into materials, materials can change their structure. And this is a phase change, and it takes time. And time means that you're going to lose power. And in niobium oxide, you have the unique feature where when you discharge it or charge it with lithium, and you go up to 2 moles of lithium per 2 moles of niobium, a significant amount of lithium insertion, you now have no phase change at all. And that's an important feature.